4th April 1944, so for 30 hours. District Commissioner's Bungalow, Kohima Ridge, Manipur State, Northeast India. Lieutenant Colonel John Laverty, aged 37, commanding officer of the 4th Battalion, Royal West Kent Regiment, pressed binoculars to his eyes and counted. In the grey pre-dawn light filtering through the valley below, movement, hundreds of points of movement, perhaps thousands. His adjutant, Captain Donald Easton, stood beside him on the veranda. Neither man spoke for 11 seconds. "Sir," Easton said finally, his voice carrying that particular flatness that comes when understatement is the only appropriate response to catastrophe. "That's rather more than intelligence suggested." Laverty lowered his binoculars. "Rather more. The Japanese 31st Division, 15,000 combat-hardened troops who'd swept through Malaya, Singapore and Burma with barely a pause, were encircling a ridgeline held by 2,500 British and Indian soldiers, half of whom were non-combatants, clerks, cooks, hospital orderlies, mule handlers. The ridge was 400 yards long. The width varied from 80 to 200 yards. In the center sat a grass tennis court, regulation dimensions, surrounded by bungalows where British civil servants had once sipped gin and discussed monsoon predictions. This was the day the British discovered that mathematics doesn't always determine outcomes, that sometimes ground matters more than numbers, and that the smallest battlefield can break the largest army. The question was simple: how do you defend the indefensible when retreat means losing India itself? Laverty returned to his headquarters, a dugout beside the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, and reviewed his assets. The 4th Royal West Kents numbered 546 men. Supporting them, elements of the Assam Regiment, Assam Rifles, Nepalese troops and the remnants of various units who'd fallen back before the Japanese advance. Total fighting strength, approximately 1,500 rifles. Against them, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato's 31st Division, supported by mountain artillery, medium machine guns and soldiers who genuinely believed they were unstoppable. They'd surrounded Kohima completely during the night. The road to Dimapur, the railhead, the supply base, the gateway to India, lay 14 miles north. If Kohima fell, nothing stood between the Japanese and the Bengali plains. At 05:30 hours, the first shells struck. "Incoming!" The shout came from a slit trench on the eastern perimeter. The Japanese had brought 75mm mountain guns to positions overlooking the ridge. They'd also dragged up 150mm howitzers. The bombardment lasted 42 minutes. In the confined space of Kohima Ridge, there was nowhere to disperse. Men pressed themselves into trenches barely 3 feet deep, into drainage ditches behind low stone walls built to keep tennis spectators from wandering onto the court. Private Arthur Swinson, Royal West Kents, later wrote, "The noise was extraordinary, not because it was louder than other bombardments, but because it was so concentrated. Every shell seemed to land within 50 yards of every other shell. The ridge simply erupted. When the barrage lifted at 06:12 hours, the Japanese infantry came. They emerged from the jungle 800 yards to the east, advancing in company-strength formations toward positions the British had designated Kuki Piquet, Jail Hill, and Dis Hill, high points that overlooked the central ridge. If those fell, the tennis court and the administrative buildings became untenable. Sergeant Thomas Wright, manning a Bren gun on Kuki Piquet, opened fire at 400 yards. "Controlled bursts," he shouted to his number 2. "Make every magazine count." The Japanese doctrine was built on aggression: close quickly, accept casualties, overwhelm defensive positions with speed and elan. It had worked in Malaya. It had worked in Burma. Their soldiers were superbly trained in jungle warfare, accustomed to night attacks, experts at infiltration, But Kohima Ridge wasn't jungle. It was open ground broken by buildings and trees with clear fields of fire. And the Royal West Kents weren't line of communication troops caught by surprise. They were regular infantry who'd spent 3 weeks preparing these positions, sighting machine guns, clearing ranges, stockpiling grenades. At 400 yards, Wright's Brengun found its rhythm. Beside him, riflemen fired deliberately, 1 shot every 3 seconds, aiming for center mass. The Japanese lead companies took casualties but didn't falter. They kept coming. 300 yards, 200. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 1,500 defenders holding a ridgeline with nowhere to retreat faced 15,000 attackers who could rotate fresh troops into the assault continuously. By every tactical calculation, by every principle taught at Staff College, Kohima should fall within 72 hours. Yet something unexpected happened in those first 2 hours of fighting, something that would define everything that followed. The Japanese reached the British wire at DIS Hill at 06:47 hours. They breached it. They entered the trench line. Hand-to-hand fighting lasted 9 minutes. Then the British counterattacked, not a formal, organized counterattack, but something more fundamental. 12 men from the Royal West Kents simply refused to yield the trench. They used bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, fists. At 06:56 hours, the Japanese pulled back. They'd taken the first line, but they hadn't broken through. Colonel Laverty received the report at 07:02 hours. He looked at his map at the red marks showing Japanese positions, now barely 200 yards from his command post, and understood something that would take London another week to grasp. This wasn't going to be a battle of maneuver. There would be no clever flanking movements, no mobile reserves sweeping in from unexpected directions. This was going to be attrition warfare compressed into an area smaller than a county cricket ground. "Get me Dimapur," he told his signals officer. "Tell them we're holding. Tell them we need everything they can send." By mid-morning, the Japanese had captured Jail Hill and DIS Hill. They now overlooked the administrative area and the tennis court from the east and southeast. Their machine guns commanded the main water point. Moving between positions in daylight became suicidal. Private George Devonshire, attached to battalion headquarters, wrote, "You couldn't walk anymore. You crawled or you sprinted and prayed." The Japanese snipers were extraordinary. They'd shoot at anything that moved, a hand reaching for ammunition, a helmet appearing above a trench lip. We found one sniper tied into a tree 70 yards from the tennis court. He'd been there 3 days. Nobody knew. The water situation became critical within 18 hours. Kohima's water supply came from springs on the slopes below the ridge. All were now in Japanese hands or covered by Japanese fire. Laverty established a roster. Water collection runs would happen only at night, using volunteers who understood they faced perhaps 30% odds of returning. How do you sustain 1,500 men with no water in temperatures reaching 32 degrees Celsius? You don't. You endure. You ration. You collect rainwater in ground sheets and helmets. You assign medical orderlies to monitor each soldier for signs of heat exhaustion and make impossible decisions about who gets the last canteen. On the second day, 5th of April, the Japanese attacked the tennis court directly. The position had become critical not because of its military value but because of its geography. The tennis court sat at the center of the British position, a flat area surrounded by slight rises. Whoever held it could coordinate defensive fire across the entire ridge. Lose it, and the British position split into isolated pockets that could be reduced individually. At 14:20 hours, Japanese infantry advanced from positions on Kuki Piquet, using dead ground to approach within grenade range. They threw Type 91 grenades, smaller than British Mills bombs, but effective in the confined space. The British responded with a defensive technique they'd refined over 2 days. Let the Japanese grenades land, count to 3, throw them back. Lance Corporal John Harman, Royal West Kents, made the calculation that sometimes one man doing something extraordinary matters more than 100 doing something sensible. He left his trench, advanced alone toward the Japanese position on Kuki Piquet while firing his Bren gun from the hip, killed 4 Japanese soldiers, captured a machine gun, and returned to British lines carrying the weapon. His company commander ordered him to stay in the trench. 3 hours later, Harman did it again, this time clearing a Japanese sniper position that had pinned down an entire platoon. He returned with bullet wounds to his shoulder and arm. He died that evening. The posthumous Victoria Cross citation would read, "His valor and utter disregard for his own safety were beyond praise." But the tactical reality was starker than any citation. The tennis court held because individuals repeatedly chose to do things that mathematical probability suggested were impossible. By 8th April, the Japanese had captured everything except the Garrison Hill area, a space measuring roughly 300 by 200 yards. Laverty's headquarters now occupied a bunker 15 yards from the tennis court. The aid station sat in a supply dugout where wounded men lay in rows, often without morphine, while Japanese machine gun fire traversed overhead. At intervals, a medical orderly could predict to within 30 seconds. If you enjoy these lesser-known British accounts of the war, consider subscribing. Now back to the moment that changed everything. The moment came on 10th April at 0230 hours. A Japanese assault company penetrated the final defensive line along the tennis court's western edge. They reached the baseline, the actual chalk line marking the court boundary, before British troops in the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow realized they were there. Fighting occurred across the net in the service boxes, along the tram lines marked for doubles play. Men grappled in darkness over ground where civil servants had once argued line calls. Sergeant Thomas Hogg, defending a position in the bungalow's ruined kitchen, later said, "I could hear them breathing on the other side of the wall. We were that close. If one of us had coughed, the other would have heard." The fight for the tennis court lasted until dawn. The British held by 20 yards, the distance from the net to the baseline. Yet something had changed, though it would take days before anyone articulated it clearly. The Japanese 31st Division had spent 6 days assaulting a position held by forces they outnumbered 10 to 1. They'd captured 90% of the objective. They'd inflicted severe casualties. They'd cut off water, subjected the defenders to continuous artillery fire, and employed every tactic that had succeeded throughout their Burma campaign. But they hadn't taken the tennis court. Why? The first answer was ground. Kohima Ridge was what military theorists call defensible terrain, ground where a smaller force can fight effectively because geography constrains how many attackers can engage simultaneously. The Japanese couldn't bring their numerical superiority to bear. They could only feed troops into narrow approaches where British machine guns waited. The second answer was supply. 14 miles north at Dimapur, the British had railways, airstrips and supply dumps that made the Normandy logistics preparations look modest. Every night mule trains carried ammunition, food, medical supplies and occasionally water up to Kohima Ridge. The Japanese supplied their troops by human portage across 60 miles of mountain jungle. By mid-April, General Sato's division was consuming supplies faster than they could be replaced. The third answer was air power. RAF Hurricanes and Vengeance dive bombers, flying from airstrips that Japanese intelligence had assumed were too distant to matter, struck Japanese positions daily. Not in overwhelming numbers, not with perfect accuracy, but enough to prevent the Japanese from concentrating forces for the final push. But the fourth answer mattered most. The British simply refused to accept the logic that said they should lose. On 14th April, Lavity met with his company commanders in a bunker that smelled of earth, blood, and the peculiar sweetness of decomposition in tropical heat. Outside, Japanese and British positions were often separated by 20 yards, in some places by 10 yards. Bodies from earlier fighting lay in no man's land between the lines because retrieving them meant dying. "Gentlemen," Lavity said, "relief is coming." The 2nd British Division, veteran troops pulled from the Arakan front, was advancing up the Dimapur road. Intelligence suggested they'd reach Kohima within 4 days, perhaps 3. "Can we hold 3 days, sir?" someone asked. Lavity looked at his map, at the red marks indicating Japanese positions that now occupied positions within grenade range of his command post, at the casualty figures his adjutant had just given him. 42% of the Royal West Kents were dead or wounded. "We'll hold," he said, "because the alternative is unacceptable." There was no dramatic speech, no Churchillian rhetoric, just a statement of fact delivered in the flat tones of a man who'd calculated the odds and decided they were irrelevant. The mathematics of attrition warfare are merciless. By mid-April, both sides were exhausted. The Japanese 31st Division had lost over 4,000 men killed or wounded, casualty rates that would cripple most formations. They were critically short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Malaria and dysentery affected perhaps 30% of their effective strength, but the British and Indian defenders had lost 600 killed or wounded from an original force of 1,500 combatants. The aid station contained 200 men in a space designed for 40. Water remained scarce. Every position was under observed fire. The perimeter had contracted to an area where you could walk its entire circumference in under 10 minutes. And still they held. On 18th of April, advance elements of the 2nd British Division made contact with Kohima's defenders. Not a triumphant breakthrough, just a patrol from the Royal Berkshire Regiment reaching the northern edge of the perimeter at 11:15 hours and confirming by radio, "We're through." The siege wasn't over. The Japanese still held dominant positions. Fighting would continue for another 6 weeks as the 2nd Division systematically reduced Japanese strongpoints in brutal close-quarters combat. But the strategic moment had passed. The Japanese offensive toward India had culminated not at the plains of Bengal, not at Dimapur with its supply dumps and railways, but at a tennis court in the hills where 1,500 men refused to move. General Sato, commanding the Japanese 31st Division, later wrote, "At Kohima, for the first time, I understood that we could not win by spirit alone. The British had supply, position, and determination equal to our own. When I realized we could not take the tennis court, I knew we would not take India." Contrary to popular belief, the Battle of Kohima wasn't won by numerical superiority or overwhelming firepower. The British were outnumbered throughout. Their artillery support was limited. Air support helped but wasn't decisive. What mattered was simpler and more fundamental. They held ground that mattered. They were supplied adequately enough to continue fighting, and they made the Japanese pay an impossible price for every yard. The mathematics that should have doomed them became irrelevant because mathematics assumes both sides will behave rationally, that a force taking 40% casualties will break, that men without water will surrender, that defenders outnumbered 10-1 will recognize the futility of resistance. The Royal West Kents didn't break. They didn't surrender. They didn't recognize futility. They simply held the tennis court. In the months that followed, the strategic consequences became clear. The Japanese offensive into India, Operation Yugo, collapsed completely. General Sato's 31st Division retreated back into Burma, having lost over half its strength. The Japanese never again attempted an invasion of India. The initiative in the Burma Campaign shifted permanently to the British, but the operational lessons mattered more. Kohima demonstrated that the Japanese army, which had seemed invincible in jungle warfare, could be stopped by determined defenders on favourable ground. It proved that British logistics, often mocked as pedestrian compared to German operational art, could sustain forces under conditions the Japanese couldn't match. It showed that air superiority, even partial and contested, changed the mathematics of siege warfare. Most importantly, it revealed that the Japanese soldiers' legendary fighting spirit had a breaking point, and that breaking point was reached when facing an opponent who simply wouldn't yield. Field Marshal Slim, commanding the 14th Army, visited Kohima in late April after the siege lifted. He walked the perimeter, examined the tennis court where the chalk lines were still visible beneath shell damage and dried blood, and spoke briefly with survivors. A staff officer asked him what he thought. "I think," Slim said quietly, "that we've just witnessed the end of the Japanese army as an offensive force in this theatre. They threw their best troops at what should have been a minor obstacle. They failed. They'll know they failed. Everything after this is just mathematics." But he was correct. The Japanese 15th Army, which had launched Operation Yugo with 95,000 men, retreated into Burma, having lost over 53,000, the single worst defeat in Japanese military history. Many died not in combat but during the retreat from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The road back to Burma became known as the Road of Bones. Kohima and the simultaneous battle at Imphal broke Japanese offensive power in Asia, as thoroughly as Stalingrad broke German offensive power in Europe. The difference was that Stalingrad involved hundreds of thousands of troops fighting across an entire city. Kohima involved 1,500 men holding a ridgeline you could walk across in 10 minutes. After the war, Colonel Laverty returned to England. He rarely discussed Kohima publicly. In 1963, during an interview for the Imperial War Museum, the interviewer asked him when he knew the ridge would hold. Laverty thought for a long moment. "The third day," he said finally. "When we held the tennis court the third day. I realized then that the Japanese had run their calculation how long it should take to reduce our position, and we'd exceeded it. Once you exceed the enemy's calculation, once you're still there when their mathematics says you shouldn't be, you've won. You just have to survive long enough for them to realize it." "What about the men?" the interviewer asked. "How did they hold?" "They were Royal West Kents," Laverty said, simply, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. The Battle of Kohima wasn't the largest battle of the Burma Campaign. It wasn't the bloodiest. More men died at Imphal, more territory changed hands during the reconquest of Burma. More dramatic actions occurred during the Chindit operations deep behind Japanese lines. But Kohima proved something that statistics couldn't measure. That will, applied to favourable ground and supported adequately, defeats numerical superiority. That 1,500 can stop 15,000 if they refuse to accept the mathematics. That sometimes the smallest battlefield determines the largest outcomes. The tennis court at Kohima still exists. A memorial now stands where men fought across chalk lines marking service boxes and tram lines. The inscription reads, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, 'For your tomorrow, we gave our today.'" What it doesn't say, what perhaps can't be said on a memorial, is simpler. They held when mathematics said they couldn't, and in holding, they changed everything. Next time on Britain in Battle, the British submarine that penetrated Palermo harbour in broad daylight surfaced among Italian warships and fired torpedoes before anyone realised she was there, and why the Italian Navy never recovered from the shock. Thank you for watching Britain in Battle. Please like and subscribe to never miss another untold British story from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? Leave your location below.